progress.
Okay, so hello everyone. We start our discussion on uneasy solidarities for anti-imperialist struggle. In this conversation, I, Tatsiana, Shchurko, and Georgy Mamedov wanted to discuss possibilities, difficulties, and ruses of thinking about and forging anti-imperialist solidarities. And it's also important that we speak from different locations like Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and the US that are affected by multiple imperialisms that may seem different, but in fact are entangled. So we came up with several questions to each other that we wanted to discuss. And I suggest to start talking about why we are interested in anti-imperialist solidarities and what experiences have influenced our understanding of anti-imperialist solidarity. And I may start this conversation, and I want to say that I'm a queer feminist activist and scholar from Belarus, currently based in the US. So my thinking is informed by my past experiences of activism and forging solidarities in Belarus under the backdrop of anti-authoritarian regimes supported by Russia. However, situated for the last 6 years in the US, I could also observe operations of another kind of imperialism and learn from the radical struggles of anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist communities here. While participating in queer feminist activism in Belarus, it was always important to me to forge transnational relations with other activists in the region and abroad, as many processes that happened in the local context, in fact, were interconnected with global relations of power. This is how we met with Georgy as a part of collaboration between Minsk and Bishkek in 2013 and 2014. And with this collaboration, I think we challenged several things that influenced actually my further thinking about anti-imperialist solidarities. So I want to map out these main points that I think are very important. So first, this collaboration at that moment, I think, was against the predominant orientation on the West in many post-Soviet queer feminist narratives and collaborations in East Europe. So instead of this gravitational pull of Western feminist frameworks, it was important to think about other locations of feminist inquiry that do not privilege imperial centers in the West or Russia, for example. Now we can see how in the post-Soviet feminist scholarship, there is this predominant interest in thinking about the region vis-a-vis the West, but seldom we can see discussions about the solidarity within the region itself. Many in East Europe and the West are often unaware of how Russian imperialism historically affected not only East Europe, but many indigenous communities in the Caucasus, Siberia, Central Asia, the far north and the far east. Forging relations between these vast and distant geographies requires understanding how difference operates in the former Second World and how power imbalance is maintained. Seeing these historical and contemporary legacies of imperialism may allow distant geographies and communities to relate to each other and thus challenge, for example, the rise of conservatism, racism, imperialist warfares, and neoliberal authoritarianism. The second point that I want to bring in is how our collaboration between Minsk and Bishkek also happened against the backdrop and contributed to ongoing conversation about the Soviet legacies, precisely the necessity to differentiate between Soviet politics and socialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist ideas, and the importance of learning from past anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist struggles. The Soviet past is often seen as a homogeneous totality that doesn't allow for an understanding of how it functioned as an imperialist formation, not just a totalitarian state, but also how socialist ideas cannot be reduced solely to the Soviet state. Not only the Soviet landscapes were occupied by diverse socialist ideas emerging not in line with state politics and especially politics developed in Russia, but histories of socialist struggles exceeded the established geographies. So anti-imperialist solidarities, about which I started to think, emerged from alternative anti-capitalist and anti-colonial struggles, for example, Black internationalism or third worldism, and many more, just to name a few. Looking at these struggles and rethinking the Soviet legacies allows us to see how anti-imperialist ethos should include anti-capitalist and anti-racist commitments. So how all the systems should be seen together. To continue, I must say that drawing on my experience of critical thinking of Russian imperialism and how it's maintained by Western institutions and my experience in the US also showed me the importance of not the division between the so-called East and West, but the entanglement. This entanglement helps imperial centers to justify or make happen many military interventions, increase militarization, maintain white supremacy, for example, through Eurocentrism and Russocentrism, and legitimize police violence against racialized communities. However, this critique of the East-West binary necessarily involves crafting a language that may alter the understanding of power in the region. Therefore, the third moment and the last moment that I wanted to bring is how this Minsk-Bishkek collaboration also contributed to our thinking about solidarity as a micro-practice, specifically to see solidarity not in declarations or state-to-state relations or institution-to-institution, but in terms of friendships, person-to-person or community-to-community intimacies and exchanges. This ongoing reflection on solidarity as a friendship and micro-practice also raises questions about the political and dissent and what solidarity as coming together may mean. Neoliberal captation of dissent made us think about solidarity and political activism in institutional terms, in terms of political representation. However, different events like protests in the US for Black Lives Matter or Belarusian protests in 2020 or the current war against Ukraine, as well as many other urgencies, show how personal relations of activists influence the mobilization of care and mutual aid, where humanitarian institutions were incapable of helping. So this is three main points that I wanted to bring to explain why I became so invested in anti-imperialist solidarities. So now I invite Georgy to jump in.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Tanya. And hello, everyone who are watching this pre-recorded discussion. So my name is Georgy Mamedov. I'm based in Bishkek, where I've been living for 11 years. I have a Russian passport and my family live in Russia, but I was born in Tajikistan. I'm curator and writer, and I'm also, as a day job, I teach History and Theory of Arts at the American University of Central Asia here in Bishkek. So thanks for inviting us for this discussion. And it's something that both, I mean, Tanya and I individually and sometimes together have been thinking a lot about the solidarity. And it seems to be like the kind of a recurring point in our discussions. And I also want to kind of get back to this 2013 when we met, and but we did not meet just as persons or as individuals. It was indeed a collaborative project between the institutions with which we were engaged at the time. And then that solidarity kind of continued in a number of other exchanges, so Minsk, Bishkek. So there were few encounters, physical, but constant collaboration and exchange of ideas and texts and practices, both personal and professional. But I think that it's interesting that moment that we started collaborating, and that this idea of solidarity in the post-Soviet space, sort of beyond a very kind of beaten passes of collaboration and exchanges, that for Kyrgyzstan very often meant being limited to Central Asian region. And I don't say that's necessarily bad, it's also part of the solidarity, but somehow just the geographical proximity determined this practice, or looking at Moscow and at Russia, not even Russia at large, but just Moscow, and then second choice St. Petersburg, for collaboration, for exchange of practices. And I guess for Belarus, that was more sort of Eastern Europe, the borderland states of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and obviously Russia. Somehow Central Asia and Eastern European part of the former Soviet Union did not necessarily had many things in common in terms of cultural, political exchanges, not even on inter-state level, but between people and individuals. But it was interesting that kind of meeting point and that collaboration proved to be very fruitful and very insightful. And then when we started probably thinking why it works like that, of course we are nice people, so we like each other, that's one thing. But there are definitely other things that kind of contributed to that, which I think later, at least for myself, I could prove it through collaborations with other people from other parts of the former Soviet periphery. So, and this is what I want to bring as a kind of, not just a descriptive kind of concept, but also as a productive term. So I think that this sort of peripheral experience contributes a lot into mutual understanding and ability to forge solidarity. So that experience that is, of course, the difference cuts across this experience if we take Kyrgyzstan or Central Asia and Belarus. Obviously, there are a lot of differences, cultural, linguistic, maybe, natural, we live in different climate zones, in different time zones. But this condition of being a periphery in the Soviet Union, within the Soviet state and in the post-Soviet space contributes a lot. It contributes in the similarity of experiences, both negative and positive. An ability also to look at the world and exchanges from a different perspective that again happens to be peripheral or marginal. It's just, the discourses to which we relate ourselves do not normally originate from the peripheries. So we always have to deal with them through this lens of being not in the center, in the imperial center. And that's, for example, compared to if we take as imperial center Moscow. But also there are, both Belarus and Kyrgyzstan are not just peripheries of the former Soviet Union of the post-Soviet space. We are also peripheral in the global capitalist reality today. And that's kind of peripheral experiences. It's also embodied. I mean, we have to speak English, which is not our first language. We are always in the position of learning English, of always kind of speaking it as a second language, struggling with it in a way. So that's another dimension which I think is important. So of this being on the periphery of the post-Soviet space and of the global capitalism. And that somehow leads, I think, maybe even on a personal level, this kind of trying to reach out to those who can understand you, if I put it that simple, to understand you, to relate to your, both to your, let's say, trauma, but also to your positive thinking. So, and I think this is what kind of makes me very much interested in understanding solidarity and anti-imperialist solidarity as kind of the solidarity of the periphery. Sometimes against the center, but sometimes even without acknowledging the center as such. Yeah, maybe that's good for the beginning. And I don't know if you want, I can proceed with the second question, unless you want to add something. Or...
Yeah, please. We can move to the next question that will clarify more.
Yeah, because I kind of felt like, okay, I have something else to say, but it relates more to
the next
second. Yeah. So I might probably have an abridged version here, but what is the difficulty of forging or even defining anti-imperialist solidarity in the post-Soviet region, within the post-Soviet region and between the post-Soviet communities and abroad? So what do you think makes it uneasy solidarity?
Yeah, and we discussed with you multiple times that now we face sometimes this epistemic impossibility to articulate this complexity about which we're talking, that we are peripheries to both the former Soviet Union, to the former Second World, but also to the global capitalist system, and at the same time situated in between multiple imperialisms. And sometimes you cannot choose one. You need to see this, to have this complex picture. And often we lack this vocabulary, how to even to use certain names or categories to understand against what structures or systems we want to solidarize, or for what life worlds and relations we want to solidarize. And I was thinking about, first of all, how this situation when the nature of Russian or Soviet imperialism is still under debate. So while now it's more apparent for many that Russia is an imperial formation, still for many issues like land relations, differences in indigeneity and racial logic are beyond the scope. And I mean both people within the former Soviet region and in the West. So while Tsarist Russia's colonial politics more fit the Western vision of imperialism and the Western definition of imperialism, the Soviet Union doesn't fit this image well, and often there is a huge debate of whether the former Soviet region can be post-colonial, or in what way we can discuss this colonial politics and imperial relations. But it is important to remember that Soviet narratives of people's friendships and solidarities that were very drastically different from the Western experience, in fact, also occlude the colonial practices of occupation and exploitation that undergirded the notions of freedom and equality. Furthermore, Soviet practices of domination included the production of gendered racialized differences, labor exploitation, appropriation of land at the expense of the destruction of communal ties and pre-modern engagements with land production and exchange. Also, non-Slavic, non-European communities of Central Asia, the Caucasus, Siberia, the Far North, and the Far East were seen as subaltern, homogeneous, and different compared to ethnicized Russians mostly, and Slavic as well, awaiting Soviet acculturation. So, but despite these histories within the region, especially in East Europe, we can see a wide held assurance that structural racism or racial difference doesn't exist in the former Soviet area, and that all post-Soviet subjects have equally experienced both the violence of the Soviet state and the emancipatory power of state socialism. And we can see how in the West recently, many challenge Western imperialism, but cannot handle the nature of Russian imperialism. In addition, the post-Cold War geopolitical imaginary produces the former Soviet spaces as homogeneous semi-alterities ascending to whiteness through the promise of liberal modernity and racial capitalism. And this leads many transnational experts, even on the left, to conclude that, for example, the Russia's war against Ukraine is just a conflict between white people and equal entities that need to negotiate the disagreements. This reflects the inability of the Western critique to comprehend imperial differences due to Western exceptionalism. And also this absence of discussions, robust discussions of the nature of Russian imperialism also leaves us without the vocabulary and grammar how to map out or define the injustices with which we deal and which we encounter, and how difference is actually produced within the region. And another aspect that I also wanted to emphasize is how still the West is seen as a freedom haven, while Eurocentrism is not often challenged. The infamous Cold War binary of communism versus liberalism prompted liberal democracy as the only option or vocabulary for political dissent. Liberalism maintains Eurocentrism that corrupts political struggles and maintains the status quo of white supremacy and capitalist accumulation. And I want to bring an example of Belarus, for example. So we can see how the authoritarian regime in Belarus, supported by Russia, is a continuation of actually long-lasting subordination of these territories by Russia since the 17th century. At the same time, the regime in Belarus is an effect of neoliberalism, and for many years, the West also made business as usual with Belarus. So in this sense, the anti-authoritarian protests of 2020 in Belarus acquire another perspective as a potentially anti-capitalist and anti-colonial struggle. However, in fact, many who participated in anti-authoritarian protests also expressed Eurocentric, racist, and migrantophobic sentiments. So for me, the question is how to make anti-authoritarian struggles also anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist, as racial difference and capitalist accumulation are core pillars of imperialism. And also the war against Ukraine also raises questions about why there was no full-scale solidarity with Chechnya in the 90s, for example, or later with Syria. So Eurocentrism and racism definitely influence how and why particular solidarities happen, and some are seen as impossible. And I mark these difficulties not to blame, but to convey the necessity of reflections on how racism, imperialism, and capitalism as interconnected systems operate on the global scale and affect local contexts as well. So as Audre Lorde invited us to do many years ago, we can learn how to deal with difference creatively. And as you, Georgy, emphasized, we tried to deal with difference creatively in our collaboration. By also reflecting on how to challenge imperialist entanglements and forge fruitful relations. Because complex imperial geopolitics and global capitalism actually link distant geographies, while violent logics travel across borders, finding sympathy among communities, aiming to construct not the communities of care, but structures of entitlement. So in this sense, I search for and call for anti-imperialist solidarity ethics that is attentive to difference, including imperial difference and global power relations. And this ethics entails radical openness to other struggles for social justice, while securing the connection to local place-based claims. So this is the main limits and gaps that I see. What are your visions on that?
Well, I think I first want to kind of pick up from what you said and also kind of react to this epistemological kind of dead end almost that we feel, which somehow comes from this peripheral experience that I explained, that you kind of deal with multiple imperialisms in the periphery, and kind of sometimes they intertwined so closely that it's very difficult to sort of disentangle them, but also sometimes they form like strange comparisons that you also kind of find it difficult to deal. Which imperialism is worse? Like that's the question I think is pretty much which is lesser or bigger evil, and that's a difficult question. But I think partly the difficulty and the complexity emerges from what you said, this disacknowledgement or unacknowledgement of difference. And in general, if you look at traditional understanding of solidarity, solidarity is always based on some sort of similarity. We talk especially in classical terms about proletarian solidarity, we are all workers. That's the underlining the foundational condition, and then all our cultural differences, linguistic differences, gender differences, they somehow secondary to that formative foundational similarity of class, which I don't want to sort of go deep into right now, but definitely the differences, play not less a foundational role than sort of our generalized, in some way universalized relation to the forces of production and to capitalism, if I simply put it. Yes, we all have to sell our labor for wage. That makes kind of this universal condition, but somehow because of its abstract nature, I mean, the differences that are more embodied, the differences that we carry with us, or specificities that we carry with us and that form this difference, they are really, really principal and cannot be just, wipe out just by, idea that there is an abstract similarity to which we have to appeal. That's one thing. But another thing important is this homogeneity of Soviet and post-Soviet experience, and in general, maybe global experience, that we turn to apply this homogeneous vision on things. And it comes, for example, from something that constantly irritates me to my guts, I would say, like this equation between the Soviet and Russia. Everything Soviet always, and especially in English, it's actually much more often in English than in Russian or in post-Soviet languages. This equation is made. Russia becomes Soviet Union, Soviet becomes Russian, and that creates this strange idea when Putin, for some reason, and the Putin's regime and what it does, like the war, seem like an ultimate continuation of the Soviet project, without kind of one important thing that in many ways what Putin does and what the regime does is somehow appealing to the pre-Soviet imperial aspects that continue to play out in the Soviet project. But now, actually, if we take Putin's rhetoric seriously, and probably by now we should, if before we could doubt and consider that cynical, performative, now I think we have to genuinely and seriously listen to what they say, and him comparing himself to Peter I, and aligning himself with all these imperial figures and bringing back this shameful, even by all Soviet standards, discourse of empire and imperial unity in his own words, but in his multiple minions, kind of indicates that there is this gap between actually kind of a serious challenge to our homogeneous idea of Soviet, post-Soviet, and even Russia. Just a simple fact, like the October Revolution continued or developed into the Civil War, which stopped in the early 1920s, but probably it never ended. I mean, it hot phase ended, but the war itself probably never ended, and it did not end in 1991. And what we are seeing, we can see that in the scope of this ongoing, slow-going civil war, in which, if anything, that was in the Soviet project that appealed to solidarity, internationalism, liberation, and equality ever existed. So Putin and the contemporary Russian regime in general is everything the opposite of it. But I think it's very difficult to make this sense, that post-Soviet space is a complex space. It's a contradictory space. And for example, for solidarities that we build, I think it's very important that it's not, yes, we call it Minsk Bishkek, but the right wingers can also call it Minsk Bishkek. Yeah, so it's important that we add these attributes, what kind of solidarity we are talking about, and that it is not just a solidarity between Minsk and Bishkek, it's a queer, feminist, leftist solidarity between Minsk and Bishkek. And I think that's an important addition to that we also kind of oppose this homogeneity and kind of crack it. That we do not necessarily represent nation states in our collaboration, that we represent Belarusian or Kyrgyz and together post-Soviet queer and feminist and leftist and anti-capitalist thinking and practice. And I think that's important. That's something that we should not omit, yeah? Which I think also opens up solidarity in different directions. Then it's not only seen through this kind of cultural homogeneous lens that we apply to the other, always kind of ascribing certain characteristics just based on our cultural and political biases. But that's one thing. But the second, another thing that I wanted to say is maybe of a less on a lower level challenge, yeah, not necessarily epistemological, but somehow connected to it. It's kind of a logistical or material challenge to solidarity. It happens always that our solidarity and our collaborations are mediated by the imperial center whatsoever, on many levels. On very simple things like logistics, whenever it was still possible and we could travel between Bishkek and Minsk, it was always via Moscow. There was no direct flight. Yeah. We had to, to go through Russia. That's one example. Well, the language is kind of a more complex thing. We speak Russian as first, second language. It's that kind of imperial colonial legacy that we all actively try to reclaim and reformulate in our terms. And that's also another similarity that I think brought us together, this kind of relationship towards creative usage of imperial legacy such as language. But if it's not in Russian, then it's in English, and then it's another kind of global north mediator of any cultural or political solidarities. But also sometimes, I mean, even our solidarity happened on Western money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is always this kind of this imperial center, this multiple imperial centers are somehow always omnipresent in our collaboration. So again, playing this dialectical role. So on one hand, this is we can say that we use these resources for solidarity, but also any solidarity that is like periphery to periphery, if I use this term, it's always an additional material effort. Complex logistics, it's always more expensive to organize the physical meetings or exchanges. If it's not within the same linguistic community, it's always a linguistic challenge, how we talk to each other. So this sort of so the very, like when we talk about this imposed globalist idea of the world in which we live, which has these centers and the periphery towards it, it influences epistemology. Like we do not have, as you mentioned, sometimes the language to describe our conditions. We find ourselves in between these imperial centers. We tend to think and reflect upon ourselves through the lens forged in those centers. but it's not only just epistemology as some sort of intangible matter, it's also a material construction of the world in which we live that also prevents or impedes our physical collaboration and coming together. Like that's also a factor of making it complicated.
Mm-hmm. And it also relates to what we once also discussed when in our conversation about the protests in Belarus in February, when you voiced this idea about the necessity of the infrastructures of solidarity, how not only to have these solidarities on a personal level, affective solidarities or solidarities that happen once in a while, but to create the real infrastructures, but also that these infrastructures are not institutions, so they're not solidified in some established structures. So how to make, so in other way, as I think about it, is how to make the solidarity sustainable. So how to make them last, and also as they drain our energies, drain resources, and all these other material aspects of how to maintain solidarity. And in this regard, I think we can also talk about our third question is how to practice solidarity in the current moment when we have these epistemic difficulties, but also material difficulties, and sometimes even misunderstanding on the level of what difference is. So how we can comprehend fully the situation, the processes that happen in the region and abroad, and build this anti-imperialist solidarity. Do you want to start in?
Yeah, I can. Well, first, following what I said and what you've been saying, I think that if we really faced with this question, how we practice solidarity, not in abstract terms, the first practical thing is that we have to accept the challenge of an effort, like the kind of this uneasiness, these barriers to solidarity, they should be fully understood. I remember that at some point back a few years ago, when I still worked in Stab, but then sometime later, we had this, we even developed this as a very explicit attitude or policy. So we do avoid imperial centers for what we do and with whom we collaborate. So whenever we do something and we need people to participate, experts, professionals, we first look outside, let's say Moscow, St. Petersburg, New York, London, whatever. And we understood perfectly that it's going to be more difficult. It's just because the information resources, the representational resources and material resources, they do tend to concentrate in the center. So it's easier always to locate a potential partner, collaborator, an expert, a lecturer, whoever, an artist that you're interested in those centers. But it doesn't mean that they do not exist elsewhere. It's just you need to, to spend more time, energy, basically making this effort to find and locate them. So I think that's important, that solidarity is not just a beautiful, nice kind of buzzword on the left, but it's kind of being open to accept that challenge, extra work and extra resources. Also, what you said earlier, which I think is a very important point, is start seeing our personal relations, personal proximities and sympathies as a resource for solidarity, and solidarity as a micro practice, as you called it. Sort of kind of not necessarily, maybe kind of politicize personal connections and friendships in a way, so that we can see them as a potential starting point for solidarity, and the vice versa. That solidarity can also lead to personal friendships and personal sympathetic relationships. So kind of not to hold these two things separate, kind of politics and and personal relationships. So they can be mutually enriching, and so that's, I think, can be a useful way of thinking how to practice solidarity. But another thing which I think which seems to me to be more complicated is to to practice solidarity, but also to kind of reimagine ourselves in solidarity. So reimagine our own belongings and communities to which we belong, and understand that something that, because solidarity kind of always implies that it's a collaboration of two parties, two communities, two people, and it's always temporary. But maybe solidarity can be also the starting point for something new. So maybe solidarity between Belarusian scholars and queer feminists and leftist activists and Kyrgyz is not just bringing Belarus and Kyrgyzstan together. It's kind of creating a new belonging, a new community, a new identity, if I may, something that exceeds those imposed on us notions of national identity. Like, I don't want to undermine them. We have passports, we have to deal with all these limitations that these supposedly constructs set upon us. But in our imagination, it doesn't mean that we have to obey to them. And that solidarity is a resource for creating new forms of belonging and kinship, if I may, and new identities. And in a way, I think another thing that we should make solidarity not just an instrument of political struggle, not reactive solidarity is important. We need to kind of come together in the help or in support of different people that go through, like people in Ukraine who go through the war now. That's obvious call for solidarity. But on a longer run, maybe we need to use solidarity as a kind of foundation of human to human and maybe human to nature relationship. Like, it might seem like strange and stupid, but I recently kind of sort of taken aback by understanding how much this individualist social Darwinist ideas got so ingrained in people's minds when they kind of talk about people being individualist, egoist. I don't know, that greed is a kind of a human, an expression of human nature, and this is how how our world operates in a way. Like, it might sound like so superficial, but this whole idea that individuals have to be self-reliant, I don't know if such word exists in English, self-reliant or self-dependent, is so ingrained, and that I think is something needs to be challenged. That basically the only way for us to exist is to be in solidarity with each other constantly. That solidarity is what somehow forms human communities. So there's kind of 3 points that understand that any practical solidarity is an effort and requires resources, material and otherwise. That solidarity can be the beginning of friendship, and friendship can be the beginning of solidarity, and they should not be mutually excluded but kind of come together. And that solidarity is the beginning for something new. It's not temporary, and that can create new communities and new imaginations. And that, yeah, solidarity is something that we have to fight for politically as a kind of a foundational value of human community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was also thinking about this, how to practice solidarity, and what you are saying is about how to make solidarity a praxis, not just a declaration. So it's how to make this relation work on different levels. And we do not mean only, I hope that we both do not mean only like a job or work that you are doing, but solidarity is this constant practical exchange that involves multiple directions and layers of how we can exchange. And while preparing, I was also looking through some of the authors that was inspired a lot about when thinking about the solidarity. And I found two interesting quotes from Sarah Ahmed and Mahanti. So Sarah Ahmed is saying collectives are formed through the very work that has to be done in order to get closer to others, end quote. And Mahanti notes similarly, quote, rather than assuming an enforced commonality of oppression, the practice of solidarity foregrounds communities of people who have chosen to work and fight together, end quote. And we can add also that communities that do not only work together, but also rest together, eat together, spend time together. So there are these multiple layers of how we can practice solidarity. And I think that now within this context, and especially with the war against Ukraine and actually multiple wars that happen around the world, these feelings of vulnerability, precarity, and estrangement that many in East Europe and not only in East Europe experience may open up this new political leeway to engage with transnational geographies of injustice, to overcoming these epistemic or political limits imposed by the global geopolitics. So, for example, also Antonina Stibur, a curator and researcher from Belarus, after the protests in Belarus, wrote, quote, when fragile bodies are excluded not only from political life, but from life in general, are endangered and beaten, made to worry about loved ones, forced to illegally cross borders, then networks of support and solidarity built on mutual recognition of our fragility become an important instrument of resistance. This, I believe, can lay the foundation and provide the potential for a new understanding of power, not as a privilege and violence, but as a function of care for the weak and the excluded, end quote. So this take on fragility and estrangement also allows us to challenge these macro narratives about the political protests that focus solely on leaders and political institutions, and actually occlude or erase embodied experiences and multiple forms of dissent that emerge in response to violence. And in this sense, connecting together this rich scholarship, but also our practice of solidarity and what you were saying, I think about solidarity as a way of coming together, staying close, longing, caring, making claims on the future in the past, as you developed in STOP, about thinking how the past also can be essential for thinking about the future. And also rethinking the current possibilities for solidarities between distant geographies may lead to seeing how different imperial formations have points of connection. For example, through neoliberal enclosures, suppressing political dissent, maintaining racial violence. So we have also points of connection, actually, because we're already connected through these imperial formations. But also what I want to emphasize is how anti-imperialist solidarities require a certain work of reflection on how we may uphold imperial logics or neglect colonial and racial violence in the local context. So this solidarity requires not only this searching for these vulnerabilities that may connect us, but also thinking how this uneasiness, these difficulties are actually also important points of reflection. Solidarities should not be easy, and sometimes it can be pretty uncomfortable, especially if you come from the position of a privilege, for example, and you need to think about your constant struggle of how not to contribute to status quo when all you're bringing and socializing requires you to contribute to the status quo. And we can see for example, we can think about the with whom solidarity is easy to articulate. And then this point is also something troubling, why it's easy to solidarize with these communities and not with others, why we forget another communities in similar situations. And in my recent article on leftist, I note, for example, how statements of solidarity with Ukraine expressed by the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia, Native American communities, but also the anti-war feminist march in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan on March 8th, point out that, for example, the war against Ukraine should be a concern for a broader transnational community. And these examples may serve as instrumental examples of alternative anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist solidarities that stretch beyond state regulations and macro politics and foreground decolonial perspectives necessary in addressing entanglements of multiple imperialisms. But also these solidarities made me think how to make them mutual. How to make them not only one-sided, so how to return back and create these relations. And one more thing that I wanted to emphasize in relation to the march in Bishkek, for example, is also how this march reminded us of the socialist roots of the International Women's Day, but also the anti-imperialist solidarities, and how we can learn from the past as well. And for example, in my research, I tried to bring in the internationalist women of the past whose actually anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist activism geared toward collective survival, transformative imagination, and political solidarity. Specifically, I explored the Black radical women at the beginning of the 20th century, how they traveled to the Soviet Union. And this solidarities also informed my understanding how anti-imperialist solidarities should always be interconnected with anti-capitalist and anti-racist solidarities. What you also emphasize, that we are not talking about anti-imperialist solidarity between authoritarian regimes that can also happen because Belarus is in solidarity with many other authoritarianisms around the world, not only within the former Soviet region. But here specifically, we talk about also about the role of capitalism and colonial legacies, how they corrupt certain political claims. So for me, this anti-capitalist solidarities, they're often attuned to the complex operations of entangled imperialisms, require a certain work of reflection on recognizing transnational operations of difference, and also cultivating this ethical obligation on how to regard one another, how to take care about one another. And in this sense, for example, Black women's engagements with and care about the former Second World, while forging interconnections against racial capitalism transnationally, are inspirational in how feminists and queer feminists may address multiple imperialisms simultaneously and connect across differences and distant geographies, while also understanding the risks of complicity and calling for radical accountability as well. So this is a radical openness to struggles, but also the desire and the necessity to talk about the radical accountability as well, how not to be complicit in these global systems. Yeah, that's generally what I wanted to say. Do you want to add?
I mean, we seem to be running out of time, but
yeah.
But I actually wanted to ask, largely in relation to what you were saying, like your whole work as your PhD was focused on these histories of solidarities, and we talked a lot about that and your research, but also the people who you researched, and their kind of were indeed very inspirational, and it made me also look much more closely to Audre Lorde, for example, who seems to be like a again recurring person whose legacy is recurring in all my communications recently. But in general, there is this tendency for me, but I think it's larger, to kind of look at history, sometimes for answers, sometimes for inspiration. And it's an important thing. And as you said, when in Stab and later, we kind of spend a lot of time trying to kind of undig or dig out these elements of the future in the past. But my question now to you, I don't know, maybe it's a difficult question to answer, but just as a short anecdote at the very beginning. So I was having a conversation with someone recently. We're talking about Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and the person was kind of saying that sometimes it's a difficult solidarity for a non-Black person. It's kind of a difficult experience to be in solidarity. And I made the remark, and that person said, well, it's not Audre Lorde's America anymore. And it's not Audre Lorde's world anymore that we live. So not everything that we can, in the view of that person, pick up from the text and from the experiences are applicable today. And that's my question, like how much this, because I think it's also an act of solidarity. Solidarity can also be directed in time. It's a solidarity with these people that we do not share physical world with, but we share ideas and maybe sensibilities, and engaging with their work. To me, it's also an act of solidarity. But yeah, how much that historical sort of focus on the solidarities of the past, on the experiences, on insights from the past, what's their relevance today? And maybe I sharpen it a little bit. Does it have any practical applicability? Should we still engage in that work, being where we are, I mean, right now?
Yeah, this very broad question, very big question, actually. And definitely, of course, the context and times change, but still, I think that these solidarities also, they were limited and also had their own flaws and difficulties, still show us that such drastically different geographies have relations. And in the past, people who experienced extreme racism, lived in the imperial center, and constantly encountered colonial violence, thought that it worth it. It worth to connect, it worth to build collective imaginaries. And it's also important to think why today these histories are erased. It's not an accident, it's not just a simple disregard. They're forgotten because we are all bought in this idea about the liberal future, when only certain kind of political is available to us, and the anti-capitalist imaginaries are displaced. So nowadays it's completely impossible. So almost all the radical activists that operated in the 60s and the 70s or even earlier, their connections to any socialist, communist, or anti-capitalist movements are forgotten. So it takes an effort to bring them back and to say that, okay, that's a great activist, but she was also a communist, she was also a socialist, and she believed in anti-capitalist futures. And still we live in the world of global capitalism, and we still need this anti-capitalist ethos and developed critique. So in this sense, for me, this past solidarities serve as inspirations of something that happened. And also it wasn't realized in a full way, or maybe we can find some failures or limits. We can still think that this connection is possible. So, okay, if we accept that this connection is possible, so what next? So what our directions of solidarity should be, what our political kinships should be. So as we also discussed with you several times, with whom we should solidarize with. Because then we can see how, for example, our struggles against capitalism and racism in the US may cause a sympathy in East Europe as well, because we also can relate to the police violence, to the state authoritarianism, and so on and so on. So we can find these points of connection. But today it seems like these connections are impossible. So while bringing these histories today, I try just to challenge this idea that these connections are impossible. But of course, bringing these connections doesn't mean, this histories doesn't necessarily mean that these connections are easy to forge or easy to build. And of course, people can be resistant, different communities can be resistant. And also we discussed during this section that many in the West and even in marginalized communities do not understand the nature of Russian imperialism. And they think that this is just two white countries that fight each other. So a lot of work should be done in order to have the sustainable connections, but it's not something unimaginable or impossible. And maybe sometimes we're thinking about how global capitalism operates across all our territories and connects actually former second world to the US, and oil connects us all together. I think that maybe we have more in common to solidarize with and to support struggles in the US and in former Soviet regions than we think they are. So yeah, this is my brief answer.
Yeah, no, but I think that's actually this research and historical work and the work of activation today, the knowledge and the practices that happened before. It's what we can call infrastructures of solidarity in material way, in a way. So we have a history of solidarities that our new collaborations, our new kind of encounters do not seem like the pioneer ones or the first ones, which I think it's very important to understand that you're not the pioneer. I think it's a too romanticized role. But on the other hand, it's also kind of, it can serve as an epistemological infrastructure, if I can use this word, kind of epistemological device that allows us exactly what you said, to imagine the possibility. So everything, even everything in our context suggests that solidarities are impossible by appealing to the experiences of the past. We can say, no, they are possible. The possible doesn't mean perfect. The possible doesn't mean flawless. The possible doesn't mean challenging and even uncomfortable, but it's still the opposite of the impossible.
Yeah. So great. Thank you for the conversation. I think we need to
stop. Yeah, otherwise we will never end. Yeah. Well, maybe we stop the recording and Tanya will be available for questions.
Yeah.